Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Gregory, and welcome to ACC4620 Auditing and Assurance 2. We're going to start reviewing Chapter 8. And the first part of Chapter 8 is Sampling and Data Analytic Tools. Now, remember, an audit is not a 100% review of everything. We have to sometimes remind management and companies that that is not our role. We are not giving 100% guarantees of the position of their financial statements, but you must gather enough evidence to support or refute your opinion and or conclusions. So sampling is just examining less than 100% of the total population. Our goal is to sample enough so that we are minimizing the risk of reaching an incorrect opinion. I've posted in the readings the link to PCAOB AS 2315, and it talks about sampling and testing procedures. So sampling is the application of an audit procedure less than 100% of the items in order to evaluate that transaction or that account class. So, for example, you'll be looking at accounts payable. You will assess the risk and the materiality, and then determine the sample size in order to ensure that you are able to support your opinion. Now, remember, management has 5 assertions. They are going to assert that there is the existence or occurrence of something, the existence of an asset, the occurrence of sales, that the information is complete, that the management will state that any asset or obligation is that they have the right to that asset or they have the obligation to that liability. Management is going to assert the valuation and or allocation of that asset or obligation, such as the value of inventory, the allocation of depreciation, the allocation of a long-term note payable. And management's going to assert that they have faithfully presented and disclosed the financial results of their organization. So you can use sampling tools to gather the evidence, such as looking at transactions, getting third-party confirmations, looking at an asset, looking at a contract of a note payable, selecting certain transactions and tracing them back to some type of source document, such as a contract, or to the existence and valuation of that asset. And then you're going to ensure in the financial presentations and disclosures that if there are any estimates, that you verified those estimates, you have valuations for those, and you have proper disclosures. You're not missing or omitting anything. And then using data analytics tools, which we'll get into a little bit later, you can take those data analytics tools to sort the transactions from largest to smallest. You can look at transactions for a specific period. You can look for unusual transactions. You can recalculate the valuation computations. And you can look at disclosures on sales and profitability by region or product. So we want to always think about management's assertions as we are approaching our sampling. So our objective is, if we're looking at internal controls or the control risk, are the controls that management is asserting operating effectively? For example, if they're stating that they secure their assets, secure some of their assets, you want to go out and look. You want to make sure that that is going on. If it is an account balance, you want to look at if and to what extent are there errors or misstatements in that account balance. And finally, you want to ensure you have enough samples. And does it represent the population? So when we look at sampling, we have to think about the sampling units, those items that make up that population. So you have the population of the accounts payable account class. Then you want to determine how many items are going to be tested in that account class and which items should be included for testing. And finally, what conclusions can you make based on those tested items that will give you an opinion as to the account classification itself? There are two risks we have to think about: non-sampling risk and sampling risk. Non-sampling risk is these are both our risks. Our risk in the non-sampling is that we reached the wrong conclusion for any reason not based on the sampling risk. So if the sampling risk is the auditor's conclusion might be different if the procedure were applied to the entire population, we would look at, did we reach an erroneous conclusion? So we might be selecting procedures that are not appropriate to achieve the objective. Maybe we're not doing the audit testing the correct way. So if we're looking at the entire AR account classification and we're looking at only confirming a sample of AR balances by sending confirmation letters out, we cannot confirm or rely on whether or not there may be unrecorded receivables in there that we didn't catch. When we're looking at our sampling risks, we have two areas we want to look at. We always look at the test of controls and we look at the test of the details or the account transactions. If we're looking at the test of controls, our risk is that looking at internal controls, we may be assessing the risk too low. Maybe we didn't look hard enough at the control environment, or we have a risk of over-reliance of the sample. For example, we over-relied on what management said and did not test enough. In the test of details, we are at a risk of accepting a transaction based on face value where it might contain a material misstatement. We may rely on the book value of an asset where it might be correct, instead of recalculating and determining if that book value is actually correct. So we're simply relying on the information and not doing our own due diligence. There are two types of sampling that we can do. One is called statistical sampling, and the other one is non-statistical sampling. So statistical sampling is probability. We may create a random generator in Excel and then select those items that pop up in the random generator. For example, perhaps we calculate a random generator and the results are to select every 5th invoice. By doing that, it's random. We don't know what's going to come up. Therefore, it's really a blind sample. Statistical is very good at making sure that we have a quantifiable sample where we have not any bias in it. The system is telling us what to sample instead of us determining it. Now, the other part is looking at non-statistical sampling, or what we call purposive sampling, where we are sampling not based on the randomness of the invoice that comes up, because in randomness, everything has a chance of being identified. In purposive sampling, we're looking at perhaps some specific criteria. So, for example, we want to look at every transaction that was posted 5 days before the end of a fiscal period and 5 days after a fiscal period. So our criteria is limited. So we develop inclusion and exclusion criteria in order to determine what our sampling basis is going to be. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. The disadvantage to random sampling is that if you don't know how to do a random number generator, you can go out and buy software, but there's a cost to that. So take a look at the cost-benefit analysis of each one. The auditors prior expectations on the accounts. Remember, we looked at what our expectation of the misstatements may be on a particular account classification. If we just have very little prior expectations because perhaps that account classification has been monitored very closely throughout the period, we may want to do a non-statistical sampling. Now, the steps in sampling. We have multiple steps. You want to make sure that you meet all of these steps. Now, the details of those steps are on pages 350 to 362 of your text. So I'm only going to give you what the steps are. So be sure you go out and look at the details. What are the attributes of interest, and what will constitute failure in your sampling? Define the population where the sample is going to come from. That could be just as easily as saying, I'm going to look at a sample of the accounts payable transactions for fiscal years 2020. Then you want to determine that sample size and determine the method, statistical or non-statistical. We select those items and perform our tests. We're going to look at those invoices. We're going to go back and maybe calculate those invoices. We're going to trace those invoices through the general ledger. And then we're going to evaluate our results. And finally, as you are performing these, even though the last step is document on a lot of these tests, be sure you are documenting the process as you are performing it. That way, you don't miss a step. So in summary of this review of part 1 of chapter 8, we talked a little bit about sampling, what management's assertions are, the objectives and risks in sampling, non-sampling and sampling risks, non-statistical and statistical sampling, and steps in attribute sampling. So be sure to read the chapter, reach out to me if you've got any questions, and I'll see you in the classroom.